This is my true story. I gave my son my best years. I thought he would give me love when I grew weak. But one night, he showed me nothing but cruelty. He raised his hand against me not once, not twice, but 9 times. Each slap burned my skin and crushed my heart. My face swelled, my eyes watered, and he laughed while I sat broken. But I was not powerless. I stood up, and I made a choice that ended his freedom. Before that, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent my whole life working like a mule to give my son comfort. From the first day he was born, I carried the weight of his future on my shoulders. I worked under the hot sun, I worked in the cold rain, and I worked even when my body begged me to stop. I saved every coin, every dollar, not for myself, but for him. I bought him clothes when I wore the same old shirt for years. I bought him shoes while my own feet stayed in worn boots. I skipped meals so he could eat full plates. I stayed awake at night fixing broken things in the house so he could wake up to comfort. Every drop of sweat that fell from my head was for his better life. I paid for his school when the bills were heavy. I made sure he had books, pencils, uniforms, and everything he needed. I worked double shifts just so he could go on school trips and never feel shame in front of his classmates. I watched him walk out the door each morning with his head high because I made sure he lacked nothing. His education cost me years of broken sleep and aching bones. But I did it with love, never asking for anything in return. When he grew older, I bought him his first car. It was not new, but it was strong, and it gave him pride. He drove it around the neighborhood, smiling, waving at his friends. He never knew the nights I stayed up working extra hours to pay for that car. He never knew the pain in my back when I came home late, too tired to eat, but still smiling because I knew he was happy. I kept it all inside, my sacrifice hidden behind my silence. I even paid his debts. When he made mistakes with money, I was there. When he gambled and lost, I covered his losses. When collectors came knocking, I stood at the door and gave them what they wanted. I told myself it was only a phase, that one day he would grow out of it. I hoped he would learn. I hoped he would see my sacrifice and give me love when I became old. But instead of gratitude, he grew arrogant. Instead of respect, he grew cruel. All my life I dreamed that my old age would be peaceful. I imagined sitting in a chair while he brought me tea. I imagined him helping me walk when my legs grew weak. I imagined hearing kind words from the boy I raised. That was my dream. A dream I worked for. A dream I believed would come true. I thought my love would be repaid with love. I thought my sacrifice would be honored. But I was wrong. What I gave him in years of sweat and struggle, he gave me back in pain and insults. My sacrifice became invisible to him. He forgot the empty stomachs I endured so his plate would be full. He forgot the nights I walked home in the dark so his car could shine in the light. He forgot the bills I paid, the debts I cleared, the tears I hid. He forgot it all. He erased it with cruelty. I was a father who gave his life for his son, and my son became the man who raised his hand against me. The first signs of cruelty did not come in one day. They came slowly, like small cracks in a wall. At first, it was his tone. He used to call me father with respect, but his voice changed. He started talking to me with sharp words, with impatience, as if I was nothing but a weight on his back. When I walked slowly, he mocked my steps. He called me old trash, as if my years of sacrifice were nothing but garbage. His eyes no longer showed love, they showed annoyance, as if my very presence made him angry. He stopped sitting with me at meals. He would sit with his wife, laughing, while I ate alone. When I asked him small questions, he answered with short, cold words, or sometimes he ignored me completely. I still tried to smile, hoping he was only tired, hoping that one day the kindness I remembered would return. But each day it grew worse. He began to raise his voice. Small things turned into storms. If I forgot to close a door, he shouted. If I dropped a spoon, he cursed. His wife would laugh at his jokes about me, and that laughter cut deeper than the words. I sat in silence, swallowing the pain, telling myself it was only a phase. But inside, my heart grew heavy. The respect was gone. The love was gone. The boy I raised with my own hands now looked at me like I was nothing. He would slam doors in my face. He would mock the way my hands shook when I tried to hold a cup. He would tell his friends jokes about me, calling me weak, calling me useless. And they laughed with him while I sat in the corner, quiet, wishing for the days when his smile used to be pure. Sometimes, late at night, I would remember the times when I carried him on my shoulders so his feet never touched the dirt. I remembered feeding him with my own hands, watching him sleep peacefully while I worked to pay bills. Those memories made the cruelty harder. How could the same boy who once held my hand at the market now push me away like a burden? But I stayed silent. I told myself he was stressed, that maybe life was hard for him. I wanted to believe there was still good in him, that my love would one day soften his heart again. I kept waiting. I kept hoping. But the truth was clear. My son was changing into something I never thought he would become. Cruelty had entered him, and soon it would show itself in a way I could never forget. The night of his violence is carved in my memory like a scar that never fades. It was a quiet evening. I was sitting in the living room, my body tired, my hands trembling from age. I asked him for a little food, just a small second serving because I was still hungry. My voice was soft, not demanding, only a father asking his own son for a little kindness. But instead of kindness, he gave me cruelty. His eyes narrowed, his lips curled, and before I could understand, his hand struck across my face. The first slap came hard, sudden, burning my cheek. My head turned with the force, and for a moment I felt dizzy. I looked at him, my eyes wide, thinking it was a mistake, thinking he would stop. But then the second slap landed. My other cheek stung. I tried to speak, but before a word could leave my mouth, the third slap cracked across my face. Each strike louder, harder, sharper. The fourth slap came, then the fifth. My ears rang. My skin burned like fire. My eyes filled with tears, not from weakness, but from the shock of betrayal. This was my son, the boy I raised, the boy I fed with my own hands, now standing over me like an enemy. His face showed no shame, only anger, only arrogance. The sixth slap made me stumble back in my chair. My body shook, my heart pounded, my chest heavy with pain. I raised my hand, not to fight him, but to shield myself. But he did not stop. The seventh slap knocked my hand away. The eighth slap made my lips bleed. And then came the ninth. The ninth slap was the hardest of them all, a strike full of rage, a strike that swelled my face, made my cheeks hot and red, made my eyes close with pain. 9 slaps, one after the other, each one stealing a piece of my dignity, each one louder than the last, until the sound of his hand striking my skin echoed in the room like thunder. And when it was over, he stepped back, breathing heavy, his chest rising and falling. He looked at me and laughed while I sat there, my face swollen, my skin burning, my heart breaking. His wife stood at the doorway, and instead of helping me, she smirked as if my pain was entertainment. I sat in silence, my face throbbing, my spirit crushed. I could feel my cheeks swelling, my lips sore, my eyes watering. My breath came slow and heavy, and I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. But inside, something was rising, something stronger than pain. The betrayal cut deep, but it also lit a fire inside me. A fire that whispered, enough. Enough silence, enough waiting, enough forgiveness. This was not love. This was violence. This was not a son. This was a brute. That night, he thought he had won. He thought his slaps would silence me. He thought the swelling on my face would bury my dignity forever. But he was wrong. Those 9 slaps did not end me. They began me. They began the revenge he never saw coming. I sat in the corner of the room after the slaps, my face swollen, my lips sore, my eyes full of water I could not hold back. My cheeks burned like fire, and each breath made me feel the sting of his hand again. My body shook, but what shook more was my heart. The pain on my skin was sharp, but the pain in my chest was deeper. My son had struck me, not once, not twice, but 9 times. His laughter still echoed in my ears, mixing with the silence of the house. I remembered when he was a boy, too small to walk on his own. I used to carry him in my arms so he would not stumble on the street. When he cried at night, I rocked him to sleep, humming softly until his breathing calmed. When he was hungry, I skipped my own meals so his stomach would never be empty. When he was cold, I gave him my blanket and shivered quietly in the dark. Those memories rose in my mind like sharp knives as I sat there, my face swollen from his slaps. I looked at my trembling hands, the same hands that once held his tiny fingers when he crossed the road. Those hands had worked every day, cutting wood, lifting stones, carrying heavy loads, all to give him comfort. And now those same hands were weak, shaking, powerless to stop his cruelty. The thought crushed me. The boy I had raised with love now stood tall as a man who raised his hand to hurt me. Shame covered me more than the pain did. The shame of being struck not in secret but in front of his wife, who stood there with cold eyes, watching as if it were a show. I could not look at her. I could not look at him. I lowered my eyes to the floor, hiding my tears, swallowing my cries. The humiliation pressed on me heavier than the slaps themselves. I felt less than human, as if I was nothing but dirt under his shoes. I remembered the many nights I walked home from work with aching feet, carrying bags full of food. He would run to the door, smiling, and hug me. Those days were gone. Now he called me old trash, and his hands, which I once taught to hold a spoon, now struck my face with cruelty. I remembered his first day of school. He cried when I left him at the gate, holding my shirt tightly, afraid to let me go. I told him I would always be there for him, and I kept my word. But now, when I needed him most, he only gave me pain. I wanted to scream, but my voice stayed inside. I wanted to fight back, but my body was too weak. All I could do was sit in silence. Silent humiliation, silent tears, silent shame. I felt trapped in that corner, like an animal that had been beaten down. And yet, even in that silence, something stirred inside me. The humiliation cut me, but it also woke me up. It told me that love had ended, that cruelty had replaced it, that I could not stay quiet forever. My face was swollen, but my mind was clear. My body was weak, but my heart was steady. I knew I could no longer depend on his kindness, because there was none. I knew I could no longer wait for respect, because it would never come. The son I raised with care had become my tormentor, and silence would only give him more power. I sat there, humiliated, broken, hurting, but also planning. Planning for the day I would rise, planning for the day his cruelty would cost him everything. My son thought the slaps made him strong. He thought my swollen face was proof that he had power. He believed raising his hand against me made him the master of the house. He believed my silence meant defeat. But he was blind. He forgot something important. He forgot the power I still carried, even in my old age. I still had the law. The law was stronger than his fists. The law did not care about his arrogance. The law did not fear his laughter. The law cared about truth, about bruises, about the swollen marks on my face. The law cared about a father who was beaten by his own son. He forgot that while he raised his hand, I still had the right to raise my voice. I still had evidence. My face was proof. My bruises were proof. My swollen cheeks told the story of his violence louder than any words could. Each mark was a record of the 9 slaps he gave me. He thought he could laugh and walk away, but every finger mark he left on my skin was a weapon I could use against him. He forgot that pain can fade, but evidence can remain. I still had witnesses. His wife had watched with her cold eyes. Neighbors had heard the shouting. People around us had seen my swollen face. They could laugh or they could stay silent, but the truth was in their eyes. He thought the walls would protect his secret, but walls cannot hide shame forever. He forgot that cruelty is never truly hidden. It leaves shadows everywhere. I still had the strength of memory. I remembered every slap. I remembered his words, his laughter, his cruelty. My body may have been weak, but my mind was sharp. He forgot that fathers do not forget when sons turn into enemies. He forgot that my silence did not mean surrender. It meant I was waiting, watching, preparing. And most of all, I still had my will. Not the will of paper, but the will of spirit. The will that had carried me through a lifetime of work. The will that had raised him from a baby into a man. That will did not break under 9 slaps. That will stood tall inside me, whispering that justice would come. He forgot that I was not powerless. He forgot that the man he beat was still the man who could end his freedom. He saw my swollen face and thought I was finished. But what he could not see was the fire inside me. A fire that his hands had lit. A fire that would not stop until justice was done. He believed fists made him master, but he forgot the truth. Power does not belong to the hand that strikes. Power belongs to the hand that signs. Power belongs to the voice that speaks the truth. Power belongs to the one who can turn cruelty into justice. And that power still belonged to me. That night, I sat alone in my small room. The mirror on the wall showed me a face I could barely recognize. My cheeks were swollen, red, and heavy. My lips were cut, and my eyes were tired from tears. I touched my skin and felt the sting of every slap. 9 slaps. 9 times my son had raised his hand against me. I counted them again and again in my mind. Each one was not just pain on my face, but pain in my heart. I looked at myself and asked, how did it come to this? I remembered the years I worked in fields, in factories, in streets, carrying heavy loads so he could have light feet. I remembered the nights I ate little so he could eat full. I remembered the sacrifices that left my back bent and my body weak. And now that same boy, my own blood, had beaten me like a stranger. My heart told me one thing clearly: enough. For years I stayed silent. For years I hoped he would change. For years I allowed cruelty to pass because I believed in love. But now the line was crossed. He did not just mock me. He did not just insult me. He struck me 9 times until my face swelled like a balloon. He laughed as if I were nothing. And that laughter echoed in my ears louder than the slaps. I knew in that moment that silence was no longer an option. I decided my son would pay for what he had done. Not with more slaps, not with more anger, but with justice. Real justice. The kind that would leave a mark on him the way his hands had left a mark on me. I decided his hands would no longer be free to strike me or anyone else. I decided the walls of a prison would be his new home. My heart was heavy, but it was also steady. I did not feel weak anymore. The pain on my face gave me strength. The shame gave me purpose. I made a promise to myself that night. I would go to the police. I would tell them the truth. I would show them my swollen face. I would show them the bruises. And I would not rest until my son, the one who mocked my weakness, sat in a cell with no pride left. I wiped my tears, stood up slowly, and looked out the window at the dark street. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. I was not just a victim anymore. I was a father who had decided to fight back, and my decision was final. My son's cruelty had written his future, and I was the one who would deliver it. The next morning, I woke up with pain still sitting heavy on my face. My cheeks were swollen like balloons, my lips split, and my skin darkened with bruises that burned with every touch. I could feel the heat of those 9 slaps every time I blinked. My head pounded, but my mind was clear. The night before, I had made a decision. Now, it was time to act. I slowly got out of bed, put on my old coat, and walked outside. The cold air hit my face and made the bruises sting even more, but that pain reminded me of my mission. I was going to the police. Every step to the police station felt heavy, but also strong. My legs were weak from age, but my heart pushed me forward. I thought about all the years I stayed silent, all the insults I swallowed, all the cruelty I endured. But now I carried proof on my face, proof that no one could deny, proof that even my son could not hide. The truth was written on my skin. Each mark was a voice, and I was going to make those voices heard. When I entered the police station, the officers looked up from their desks. Their eyes widened when they saw me. They did not need to ask many questions. My face told half the story before I even opened my mouth. One officer stood up and walked toward me. He spoke softly, asking, "What happened, sir?" My voice shook, but I forced myself to answer. My son. He slapped me 9 times. He would not stop until my face swelled. He laughed while he did it. They sat me down in a chair and gave me water. The officer called another to take notes. I repeated everything slowly, one detail at a time. I told them how it started with anger, how he raised his hand again and again, how I counted each slap until I reached 9. I described the pain, the humiliation, the laughter that followed. I explained that this was not the first cruelty, but it was the worst. And now, I wanted justice. The officers looked at my face closely. One of them nodded and called for a camera. They took photos from every side: the left cheek, the right cheek, the lips, the chin, even the swelling around my eyes. The flash of the camera burned my skin, but I stayed still. Each click was a record, each photo a weapon against him. They wrote down the words assault and elder abuse in their report. They asked me to sign the statement. My hands trembled, but I pressed the pen to paper and signed my name. My signature was weak, but it carried more power than all 9 slaps combined. They also asked me about witnesses. I told them his wife had stood there, watching with her cold eyes. I told them neighbors had seen my swollen face right after. They wrote those names down. They told me they would visit and confirm. The truth was now spreading beyond my walls. My son thought his violence would remain hidden in our house, but now it was being written in official papers. His cruelty was no longer private. It was now public. As I sat in that station, I felt something I had not felt in years: dignity. For so long, I thought silence was my only choice. For so long, I thought love meant endurance. But as the officers stamped my report and filed it, I realized I had done what he never expected. I had raised my voice. I had used the law. I had turned my swollen face into evidence. My silence had ended, and in its place stood a record that could not be erased. One officer leaned closer and said, "Do not worry. We will handle this." His words filled me with relief. For the first time, I felt I was not alone. The law stood beside me. The law would carry the weight that my old shoulders could no longer bear. I walked out of the station slowly, but with my head higher than it had been in years. Behind me, the report lay on the desk, sealed, signed, and stamped. My son's fate had been written. As I walked home, people stared at my swollen face. But this time, I did not lower my eyes. This time, I did not hide my shame. This time, I let them see. Let them ask questions. Let the truth spread. I had reported him. The law was moving. Soon the same hands that had slapped me would be chained behind his back. That day, I learned something important. Fists can hurt the skin, but truth can crush the spirit. My son had forgotten that. Now, he was going to learn it the hard way. 2 days after I filed the report, the police came. I was sitting quietly by the window when I saw their car pull up in front of the house. My heart beat faster. I knew this was the moment. I stood up slowly, walked to the door, and opened it just as they stepped out. There were 3 officers. Their uniforms looked sharp, their steps were heavy, their faces serious. One of them looked at me and nodded. "We are here for him," he said. I pointed toward the living room. My son was sitting there on the couch, scrolling through his phone, acting like he owned the world. He did not know what was coming. The officers walked inside, their boots echoing against the floor. My son looked up, annoyed, and asked, "What do you want?" His arrogance was still alive, even with the law standing in front of him. One officer stepped closer and said firmly, "You are under arrest for assault and elder abuse." My son's smirk disappeared. He laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. "This is my father. He won't do anything. He's weak. He needs me." But the officer did not laugh. He pulled out the papers, the warrant signed with my name and the evidence. My son's eyes widened as he read the words. His face drained of color. When the officer reached for his arm, my son resisted. He pulled back, shouting, "This is my house! You can't touch me!" But another officer stepped forward, grabbing him firmly. They twisted his arms behind his back and snapped the cold metal of the handcuffs onto his wrists. The same hands that had slapped me 9 times now clinked with chains. The sound of the cuffs locking was sweeter to me than any music. Neighbors began to gather outside. They peered over fences, stood on porches, whispering to each other. They watched as my son, once so arrogant, was dragged out like a criminal. Some shook their heads, others whispered, "He hit his father. Now look at him." The shame that I had carried silently now wrapped itself around his neck. He tried to shout back, but the officers pushed him forward. His voice cracked. He looked at me with eyes full of shock and anger. "You did this!" he screamed. I stayed silent, my face calm. Silence was my answer, and it cut him deeper than words. His wife ran to the door, her voice trembling. She begged the officers to stop, saying it was a misunderstanding. But the bruises on my face, the photos in the police files, and the witnesses had already spoken. The officers ignored her pleas. She stood frozen in the doorway as her husband was dragged to the car. They pushed him into the back seat, his head bent low, his pride, once tall, now broken. I walked slowly to the gate and watched. The car engine started. The officers sat straight in their seats. My son sat trapped, his hands cuffed, his eyes full of rage and fear. He shouted one last time, "You'll regret this." But his words had no power now. The car drove away, carrying him to the cell he had earned with his own hands. I stood at the gate until the car disappeared. The neighbors still stared, but this time they did not look at me with pity. They looked at me with respect. They saw a father who had suffered, but who finally stood tall. They saw justice. My face was still swollen, but inside, I felt light. The burden I carried for years was gone. The law had spoken. The arrest was done. My son's cruelty had led him to chains, and I had watched it with my own eyes. The days after his arrest changed everything. My son, who once walked with his head high, was now locked inside a cell. The walls that surrounded him were gray, cold, and heavy. He slept on a hard bed, ate plain food, and wore the same rough clothes as every other prisoner. The hands that once slapped me 9 times now pressed against iron bars. His arrogance had no place there. The laughter he once used against me was gone. In the cell, there was no pride, no power, only silence. News of his arrest spread quickly. Neighbors whispered his name at the market. They shook their heads and said, "He hit his own father." Now he is in prison where he belongs. Relatives who once praised him now turned away. Some said he had shamed the family name. Others said they always knew he had a cruel heart. Friends who used to sit at his table stopped calling. His phone, once full of numbers and messages, now lay silent. He was left with no one but himself. At work, his downfall was even louder. The place where he boasted about being powerful now carried only his shame. His boss received the report from the police. His colleagues whispered about him in the hallways. They shared the story of how a man who looked strong on the outside was nothing but weak on the inside. They laughed quietly, not with him, but at him. His name was removed from the company records. His seat stayed empty. His job, his income, his future there, all gone. Even his wife began to distance herself. At first, she tried to defend him. She said I exaggerated, that it was a misunderstanding. But when she saw the photos of my swollen face, when she heard the police call it elder abuse, she had no more words. Her friends judged her, her family whispered behind her back, and slowly she pulled away. She stopped visiting him in jail. She stopped answering his calls. One day, she packed her bags and left. She wanted no part of the shame he carried. In the prison, he begged the guards for small favors, but they ignored him. He tried to act proud, but other inmates saw through him. They mocked him when they learned his crime. "You hit your own father?" they asked. "And you thought you were a man?" Their words cut deeper than chains. He sat alone in corners, his head down, his hands covering his face. The same man who once stood tall in my house now crouched like a shadow in a cage. At night, he called me from the prison phone. The guards let him make short calls, but I never answered. He left messages, his voice broken, his words shaking. "Father, Please forgive me. Please take me out. I made a mistake, but I stayed silent. Silence was my justice. He had slapped me 9 times and laughed. Now the world slapped him with shame, and no one laughed with him. The fallout was not just in his life, it was in his soul. The man who thought he controlled me was now controlled by bars and guards. The man who thought he could raise his hand against me was now forced to lower his head to strangers. He had no power, no respect, no freedom. The same pride that made him cruel was now crushed into dust. I walked through the streets with my head high. My face still carried scars, but my spirit carried strength. People who once looked at me with pity now looked at me with respect. They said, "He did the right thing." He stood up. He showed that even in old age, dignity matters. I felt lighter with each word. I felt stronger with each nod. I was no longer the weak old man sitting in silence. I was the father who chose justice, and justice had been served. My son rotted in his cell. His pride was gone, his name was stained, his future destroyed. And I watched it all with calm eyes. This was not revenge born from hate. This was justice born from truth. He had chosen violence, and violence had chained him. I lived the rest of my days in peace. I was no longer afraid in my own home. I was no longer silent at my own table. I could sit, eat, and sleep without hearing cruel words or feeling the sting of a hand. My face healed, but the scars in my heart reminded me every day why I chose justice. Those scars were not weakness. They were proof that I survived, proof that I rose after being beaten down. I spent my mornings in the garden, feeling the sun on my skin, breathing fresh air, free from fear. Neighbors came to greet me, their voices soft with respect. Some even said, "You are brave. You showed us all that no one is too old to fight back." Their words gave me strength. I was no longer just an old man. I was a man who proved that cruelty has a price. My son sat behind bars. Each day in that cell was a day of reflection for him. He thought fists made him strong, but now iron bars showed him what real strength was. He thought laughter at my pain made him powerful, but now his cries in the night echoed in prison walls. The same hands that slapped me 9 times were now chained and watched. He begged for freedom, but freedom had left him. He begged for respect, but respect had died the day he raised his hand against me. I never went to visit him. I never answered his calls. I never wrote him letters. My silence was my answer. I let him sit with his guilt, his shame, his regret. I let him learn that violence may give power for a moment, but justice takes it away forever. And I found peace in knowing I did not strike back with fists. I struck back with truth. I struck back with the law. I struck back with dignity. The law gave me justice when his hands gave me pain. That justice was sweeter than any revenge. In the end, my legacy was not broken. My story was not ended by cruelty. My name was not destroyed by his arrogance. I lived with dignity, surrounded by respect, free from fear. And he lived in a cell, surrounded by shame, trapped by his own choices. He slapped me 9 times until my face swelled. But I reported his violence, and I watched him rot in a cell.